1962, America's highest-ranking military leaders, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, proposed a terrifying plan to launch a war against Cuba. It was called Operation Northwoods, a false flag campaign designed to deceive the American public into supporting an invasion. Why? Because Cuba, under Fidel Castro, had aligned itself with the Soviet Union right at America's doorstep. In the eyes of Washington, a communist ally of Moscow just 90 miles from Florida, was an unacceptable threat in the heart of the Cold War. And so, the Pentagon drafted a shocking proposal, one that would stop at nothing to escalate the conflict. They proposed blowing up a U.S. Navy ship in Guantanamo Bay and blaming Cuban forces, staging fake funerals for victims to enrage the public, shooting down a drone disguised as a passenger jet, claiming Cuba killed U.S. civilians, bombing civilian targets in Miami and Washington, and blaming Castro, sinking a boat of Cuban refugees just to provoke outrage, even orchestrating sniper attacks on American streets. All of it, real proposals, signed off at the highest levels, just one approval away from execution. This was more than Cold War paranoia. It was the beginning of a years-long obsession to remove Castro by any means necessary. Let's go back to where this all started. In the 1950s, Havana was a jewel of the Caribbean. Neon lights lit up the night sky. American tourists flooded the island, drawn by its beaches, casinos, and vibrant nightlife. But this wasn't just a vacation hotspot, it was big business. By the end of the decade, U.S. companies owned nearly half of Cuba's sugar plantations, 90% of its telephone and electric services, most of its oil refineries, and a majority stake in its banks and railways. The island's economy was deeply entangled with American interests. Profits flowed out of Cuba and into the pockets of U.S. corporations, like United Fruit Company, ITT, and Standard Oil. While average Cubans struggled with poverty, poor health care, and limited education. All of this was protected by the regime of Fulgencio Batista, a military dictator who rose to power with U.S. backing. Under Batista, American mobsters also found a haven. Figures like Meyer Lansky turned Havana into a playground of vice, running luxurious casinos and hotels with government protection. But for the Cuban people, Batista's rule was brutal. Political opponents were jailed, tortured, or killed. Corruption was rampant. And in the countryside, many lived in huts with no running water or electricity. Then, in 1959, Fidel Castro and his revolutionaries swept into Havana, overthrowing Batista and promising justice, land reform, and sovereignty. At first, the U.S. watched cautiously, but Castro's policies quickly made his intentions clear. He nationalized American-owned land and industries without compensation. He cracked down on opposition, embraced Marxist ideology, and began forging close ties with the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union, eager to gain a foothold near U.S. shores, saw an opportunity. When the U.S. cut Cuba off economically, the Soviets stepped in, buying Cuba's sugar, its most vital export, and sending oil, credit, and technical support in return. The two nations were drawn together not just by trade, but by a shared ideology and a mutual enemy. To Washington, the alarm bells were deafening. The Soviet-aligned, communist state just 90 miles from Florida was unacceptable. Diplomatic ties were cut, sanctions were tightened, and soon the U.S. began plotting in secret. The result was Operation Mongoose, a covert campaign launched in late 1961, designed to undermine Castro's regime from the inside. But what exactly was Operation Mongoose, and how far was the U.S. willing to go to remove Fidel Castro from power? Operation Mongoose was no ordinary intelligence mission. It was a full-scale covert war against Cuba, orchestrated by the CIA and overseen by the U.S. Department of Defense, with direct support from the White House. Approved by President John F. Kennedy in November 1961, the operation was placed under the control of Brigadier General Edward Lansdale, a seasoned expert in psychological warfare. The mission: topple Fidel Castro's government by October of 1962. To achieve that, Operation Mongoose employed hundreds of agents, operatives, and informants. It mobilized a multi-agency task force, bringing together the CIA, FBI, State Department, and even military intelligence. Together, they would wage economic sabotage, psychological warfare, and terrorist-style disruption, all without officially declaring war. Over 33 plans were drafted and submitted by the CIA between January and October of 1962. Many read like scenes from a Cold War thriller. Here's just a glimpse of what was considered: contaminating crops and livestock with chemicals and biological agents to create food shortages, launching raids on Cuban coastal towns, disguised as anti-Castro rebels, to spread panic and make the regime appear weak, sabotaging Cuban factories, power plants, oil refineries, and railroads, spreading forged documents suggesting Cuban officials were secretly collaborating with enemy nations, even poisoning Castro's cigars, contaminating his diving suit with a fungus, or planting explosives in seashells where he went snorkeling. The operation didn't just target infrastructure, it targeted Castro himself. Over the years, the CIA devised hundreds of plots to assassinate him, making Castro the most targeted foreign leader in U.S. history. Operation Mongoose was intended to provoke uprisings, cause chaos, and make Cuba ungovernable. One of the core strategies was to spark internal rebellion, to convince the Cuban people that Castro had failed them, and push them to rise up. But the plan was riddled with problems. Cuba had an extensive surveillance network, and Castro's popularity, especially after standing up to U.S. pressure, was stronger than Washington had anticipated. Still, the operations continued. Between 1961 and 1962, the CIA ran hundreds of missions, from propaganda drops to supply runs for anti-Castro guerrillas. Operation Mongoose was one of the largest covert action programs the CIA had ever attempted. It was massive, dangerous, and illegal under international law, but it wasn't enough. Despite the sabotage, psyops, and assassination attempts, Castro held on to power. Worse yet, his alliance with the Soviet Union only grew stronger. Operation Mongoose had failed, and that's when the U.S. government considered going further, much further. If Castro couldn't be removed through sabotage, then perhaps the American people could be convinced to demand war themselves.
Freedom has many difficulties, and democracy is not perfect.
That's where Operation Northwoods came in. Drafted in March 1962 by the Department of Defense and endorsed by all members of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Northwoods proposed a chilling solution: manufacture a justification for war through lies, false flags, and staged violence. Here's just some of what they proposed: blow up a U.S. Navy ship in Guantanamo Bay, stage funerals, blame Cuba, hijack or destroy a drone airliner painted to look like a passenger jet, claim Americans were killed by Cuban forces, bomb American cities, Miami, Tampa, even Washington, D.C., then blame the explosions on Cuban terrorists, sink boats full of Cuban refugees to spark public outrage, stage sniper attacks on civilians and plant bombs in public places, all blamed on Cuban agents. These weren't the ravings of fringe conspiracists. This was a formal military proposal, signed by the highest-ranking generals in the U.S. military: General Lyman Lemnitzer, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs; General Curtis LeMay, Air Force Chief of Staff; Admiral George W. Anderson, Jr., Chief of Naval Operations; General George Decker, Army Chief of Staff; General David M. Shoup, Marine Corps Commandant. And it made its way all the way up the chain of command, to the Secretary of Defense, and finally, to President John F. Kennedy. Kennedy was appalled. He rejected Operation Northwoods outright, and tensions between him and the Pentagon escalated quickly. Soon after, General Lemnitzer was removed from his position as chairman of the Joint Chiefs. The plan was buried, forgotten, classified for over 3 decades. But when it was finally declassified in 1997, the details shocked even the most hardened skeptics. Northwoods showed just how far America's own military leadership was willing to go, not only to remove Castro, but to manipulate the public, ignite a war, and reshape the course of history. And while the plan was never carried out, its existence forces us to confront a chilling truth. In the fog of Cold War paranoia, the greatest threat to American lives didn't just come from abroad, it could have come from within.